Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, the year 1916. The world has been consumed by a war unlike any other in human history. Across the fields of France and Belgium, millions of young men find themselves trapped in a hellish maze of mud, barbed wire, and constant terror. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful sleep, we'll explore one of history's most harrowing chapters, the daily reality of life in the trenches of the First World War. This is a story not of glory or heroism, though both existed, but of endurance, of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, of how the human spirit persevered in conditions that challenged the very essence of what it meant to be alive. Welcome to Doze Through History. I'm your guide through the shadows of the past, and tonight, we descend into the Western Front. If you're new to our channel, we explore history's most fascinating stories in a gentle, sleep-friendly format. Consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We journey through time together every week, helping you drift off to peaceful dreams while learning about our shared human experience. The trenches of World War I didn't spring into existence overnight. They were born from necessity, carved from desperation, and deepened by the grim realization that this war would be unlike any other. In the autumn of 1914, as the leaves turned golden across the European countryside, two massive armies faced each other across the rolling hills of France and Belgium. The German advance had been halted at the Marne, and what military strategists had predicted would be a swift, decisive conflict was already showing signs of becoming something far more sinister. Picture, if you can, the moment when warfare changed forever. Soldiers on both sides, exhausted from weeks of marching and fighting, began to dig. Not grand fortifications, not mighty castles, just simple holes in the earth. Protection from the increasingly deadly accuracy of rifle fire and the devastating new machine guns that could mow down hundreds of men in minutes. These first trenches were little more than ditches, scraped hastily from the soil with whatever tools the men could find. Bayonets became shovels. Mess tins became earth movers. Bare hands clawed at the dirt when nothing else was available. The soldiers told themselves these were temporary measures, that surely the war would end by Christmas. Christmas came and went. The ditches grew deeper. What began as simple furrows in the earth evolved into an elaborate underground city that stretched for over 400 miles, from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This was the Western Front, a continuous line of fortifications that would define the war and consume the lives of millions. The evolution of trench design became a deadly art form. Engineers on both sides studied the other's innovations, always seeking that slight advantage that might break the stalemate. What started as straight lines became zigzag patterns to prevent enemy soldiers from firing down the entire length of a captured trench. Single trenches became complex networks with multiple lines of defense. As 1914 became 1915, and 1915 stretched into 1916, the temporary shelters became permanent homes. The Western Front crystallized into its final, terrible form, two parallel lines of trenches separated by a wasteland that men would come to call no man's land. To understand life in the trenches, we must first understand the trenches themselves. They were not merely holes in the ground, but complex underground cities designed by military engineers who had studied the devastating lessons of modern warfare. The frontline trench was typically 6 to 8 feet deep and 4 to 6 feet wide. Deeper meant better protection from shell fragments, but it also meant more water collecting at the bottom during the frequent rains. The walls were reinforced with whatever materials were available: wooden planks scavenged from destroyed buildings, corrugated iron sheets, sandbags filled with the ever-present mud. Along the bottom of the trench ran wooden boards called duckboards, raised slightly above the muddy floor to provide soldiers with a relatively dry surface to walk on. But relatively dry was a generous term in many sectors, especially during the rainy seasons. The duckboards floated like makeshift rafts on a sea of liquid mud. Fire steps were cut into the front wall of the trench, allowing soldiers to stand and peer over the parapet or fire their rifles at the enemy lines. These steps became the stage for the daily ritual of stand-to, those tense moments at dawn and dusk when attacks were most likely to come. Behind the frontline trench lay a complex network of communication trenches, support trenches, and reserve positions. Communication trenches, often called saps, zigzagged back toward the rear, allowing soldiers and supplies to move forward without exposing themselves to enemy fire. These trenches had names, some official, some coined by the soldiers themselves. Piccadilly Circus, Bond Street, Hellfire Corner, names that brought a touch of dark humor to an otherwise hellish landscape. Support trenches ran parallel to the front line, typically 80 to 100 yards behind. This is where troops waited in reserve, where medical aid stations were established, and where the wounded were brought for initial treatment. Behind these came the reserve trenches, command posts, and eventually the artillery positions. But perhaps the most crucial element of trench architecture was what lay between the opposing lines: no man's land. This desolate strip of earth, varying from 50 yards to over 400 yards in width, was a moonscape of shell craters, tangled barbed wire, and the detritus of war. During the day, it was a killing field where nothing could move and survive. At night, it became a place of whispered patrols, desperate rescues, and the gradual accumulation of the war's human cost. If this exploration of history is helping you unwind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Doze Through History. We have many more fascinating journeys through time waiting for you, all designed to help you drift off to peaceful sleep while expanding your knowledge of our shared human story. Life in the trenches followed a rhythm as regular as a heartbeat, though far less comforting. This routine was born from necessity, refined by experience, and sustained by the simple human need to find normalcy even in the most abnormal circumstances. The day began before dawn with stand to, short for stand to arms. In the gray twilight before sunrise, when visibility was poor and attacks most likely, every man in the frontline trench would climb onto the fire step, rifle in hand, bayonet fixed, peering into the gloom toward the enemy lines. This was often the most dangerous time of day, when nervous soldiers might fire at shadows, when snipers claimed their first victims, when the day's casualties began to mount. For 30 minutes to an hour, thousands of men would stand in absolute silence, watching and waiting. Officers moved quietly along the line, checking weapons, whispering words of encouragement or warning, ensuring that their section of the line was ready for whatever the day might bring. As the light grew stronger and the immediate danger of dawn attack passed, the soldiers would climb down from the fire step and begin the day's routine. Weapons were cleaned and inspected. A rifle clogged with mud could mean death, not just for the soldier who carried it, but for his comrades who depended on his fire support. Breakfast, when it was available, was often a cold affair. Hot food required cooking fires, and cooking fires drew enemy artillery like magnets. Instead, soldiers subsisted on hard biscuits, tinned meat of questionable quality, and jam that had often spoiled in the damp conditions. Water, when it was clean, was precious. When it wasn't clean, which was most of the time, it was still precious, just dangerous. The morning hours were typically reserved for maintenance and improvement of the trench system. Parapets needed constant repair from the previous night's shelling. Duckboards had to be replaced when they rotted or were blown apart. Drainage ditches required digging and redigging as they filled with mud and debris. This work had to be done carefully, quietly. Any sound that carried across no man's land might draw sniper fire or artillery bombardment. Soldiers learned to work with hand signals, to move without creating silhouettes against the sky, to make themselves invisible even while performing the most mundane tasks. The afternoon brought different challenges. In many sectors, this was the time for rest, or what passed for rest in the trenches. Men would huddle in dugouts carved into the trench walls, trying to catch a few hours of sleep despite the constant background noise of distant artillery, the occasional crack of sniper fire, and the ever-present sounds of an army trying to sustain itself under impossible conditions. But even sleep was dangerous. Dugouts could become tombs if a shell landed in just the wrong place. Many soldiers learned to sleep lightly, one ear always listening for the whistle of incoming artillery, the cry of gas attack, or the sound of enemy movement that might signal a raid. While enemy soldiers posed an obvious and immediate threat, they were far from the only dangers that stalked the trenches. In many ways, the invisible enemies, disease, vermin, and the slow psychological erosion of constant stress, claimed more victims than bullets and shells. The rats were perhaps the most visible of these invisible enemies. Trench rats were unlike anything the soldiers had encountered in civilian life. Fed on the rich diet of human flesh that littered no man's land, they grew to enormous size. Some soldiers reported rats as large as cats. They were fearless, aggressive, and seemingly indestructible. They scurried over sleeping men's faces, gnawed through equipment, and contaminated precious food supplies. The soldiers developed various methods for dealing with the rat problem. Some units organized rat hunts, using bayonets and clubs to kill as many as possible. Others tried poison, though this often proved as dangerous to the soldiers as to the rats. A few men discovered that certain terrier dogs, when they could be smuggled into the line, were excellent rat catchers. But for every rat killed, 10 more seemed to take its place. Lice were another constant torment. These tiny parasites infested clothing, bedding, and hair, causing incessant itching and serving as vectors for disease. Soldiers would spend hours chatting, picking lice from their clothes and crushing them between their fingernails. The distinctive popping sound became so common that it gave rise to the term for casual conversation. The dampness of the trenches created ideal conditions for a host of fungal infections. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet conditions, could cripple a soldier as effectively as a bullet wound. Feet would swell, develop open sores, and in severe cases become gangrenous. Officers learned to conduct daily foot inspections, checking their men's feet like a stable master checking horses' hooves. Dysentery stalked the trenches with relentless efficiency. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and the stress of combat created perfect conditions for intestinal diseases. Men would suffer from severe diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness, conditions that could prove fatal in an environment where physical strength often meant the difference between life and death. But perhaps the most insidious enemy was the one that couldn't be seen, couldn't be fought with weapons or medicine, and couldn't be escaped through courage or determination. Shell shock, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, began to appear among soldiers who had endured too much for too long. Men who had shown remarkable bravery under fire would suddenly be unable to stop their hands from shaking. Soldiers who had faced death with apparent calm would begin jumping at every sound. Some men lost the ability to speak, others couldn't stop talking. The military medical establishment of the time had little understanding of these invisible wounds, often treating them as cowardice or malingering. Among all the horrors of trench warfare, perhaps none struck more terror into the hearts of soldiers than the development and deployment of chemical weapons. The first large-scale use of poison gas on April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, marked a new and sinister chapter in the evolution of warfare. The German attack began with the release of chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders along a 4-mile front. A yellow-green cloud drifted slowly across no man's land toward the Allied trenches, carried by a gentle breeze that seemed almost peaceful in its deliberate motion. The soldiers in the opposing trenches watched the strange phenomenon with curiosity rather than alarm, until the first men began to choke. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system, causing the lungs to fill with fluid as the victim essentially drowns in his own body's defensive response. Men fled in panic, abandoning their positions, gasping and clawing at their throats. Those who couldn't run fast enough simply collapsed, their faces turning blue as they suffocated. The immediate tactical success of this first gas attack was limited. The Germans were almost as surprised by its effectiveness as their victims and failed to exploit the gap it created in the Allied lines. But the psychological impact was profound. Soldiers now had to fear not just bullets and shells, but the very air they breathed. Both sides quickly escalated their chemical warfare capabilities. Chlorine was followed by phosgene, a more deadly but less detectable gas. Then came mustard gas, which attacked not just the lungs but the skin and eyes, causing painful blisters and, often, blindness. Each new chemical weapon prompted the development of new protective equipment and tactics. Gas masks became as essential as rifles. Early masks were crude affairs, cloth soaked in chemicals, held over the nose and mouth. As the war progressed, they evolved into more sophisticated devices with charcoal filters and full face coverage. But even the best masks were imperfect, and wearing them was an ordeal in itself. Vision was restricted, breathing was labored, and communication became nearly impossible. The psychological warfare aspect of gas attacks was perhaps as important as their physical effects. The cry of "gas! Gas!" would send entire units into panic. Men would fumble for their masks in the dark, never certain whether the alarm was real or false, never sure whether their equipment would protect them. Some soldiers developed such severe anxiety about gas attacks that they would refuse to remove their masks even when it was safe to do so. Gas attacks also changed the rhythm of trench warfare. Weather conditions became critically important. Wind direction and speed could determine whether an attack would succeed or backfire catastrophically on the attackers. Soldiers became amateur meteorologists, constantly checking wind direction and weather patterns. The deployment of gas weapons also required new tactical approaches. Attackers had to be prepared to advance through areas they had just contaminated, wearing their own protective equipment and moving more slowly than in conventional attacks. Defenders had to maintain their positions even while choking and partially blinded, trying to resist an enemy they could barely see. As you settle deeper into comfort tonight, remember that these stories from history, however dark, remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the preciousness of peace. If you're finding these historical journeys helpful for relaxation, please consider subscribing to Doze Through History. We explore the past together, helping you drift toward peaceful dreams. In the trenches of the Western Front, sound became a language of survival. Every noise carried meaning, every silence held potential danger. Soldiers developed an acute sensitivity to the acoustic landscape of war, learning to distinguish between friendly and enemy artillery, to recognize the approach of different types of shells, and to identify threats long before they became visible. The constant background symphony of the Western Front was artillery fire. During major offensives, the bombardment could be heard from hundreds of miles away. In London, the sound of the guns at the Somme was audible as a distant rumbling, like perpetual thunder on the horizon. But for the men in the trenches, this wasn't distant thunder. It was the soundtrack of their daily existence. Each type of shell had its own distinctive sound. The heavy German artillery pieces fired shells that made a sound like an express train rushing overhead, followed by the earth-shaking crash of impact. Lighter shells made sharper, whistling sounds. Mortars, short-range weapons that lobbed their projectiles in high arcs, created their own unique acoustic signature. A hollow thump followed by a brief silence, then destruction. Soldiers learned to gauge their danger by these sounds. A shell that you could hear approaching was probably not going to kill you. By the time the sound reached your ears, the shell had likely already passed overhead or landed nearby. It was the shells you couldn't hear that were the most dangerous, the ones that arrived with no warning except the sudden eruption of earth and shrapnel. Machine gun fire added its own rhythm to the orchestra of war. The German Maxim guns had a distinctive sound, a steady, mechanical chatter that could continue for minutes at a time. Allied machine guns often fired in shorter bursts, creating a different pattern of sound. Experienced soldiers could tell which side was firing, from what direction, and approximately how far away, all from the sound alone. Rifle fire was more sporadic but no less meaningful. A single shot might indicate a sniper at work, methodically targeting officers or anyone careless enough to show themselves above the parapet. Volley fire from multiple rifles suggested a raid or attack in progress. The crack of bullets passing close overhead became so common that many soldiers learned to ignore it, a dangerous adaptation that sometimes proved fatal. But it wasn't just the sounds of combat that shaped life in the trenches. The everyday noises of an army trying to sustain itself created their own patterns and meanings. The rumble of supply wagons moving up at night, the clink of mess tins during meal times, the shuffle of feet on duckboards as reliefs moved into position. All of these sounds had to be evaluated for their potential to attract enemy attention. Night brought its own acoustic challenges. Sound carried farther in the cool air, and the relative quiet made every noise seem magnified. A cough, a dropped rifle, the scrape of a boot against wood could bring down sniper fire or artillery bombardment. Units developed elaborate sound discipline procedures, teaching soldiers to move silently, communicate through whispers or hand signals, and time their activities to mask noise with the sounds of distant artillery. Perhaps most unnerving of all were the sounds from no man's land. During the day, this area was largely silent except for the occasional crack of sniper fire. But at night, it came alive with noise. The wounded would cry out for help, their voices carrying across the wasteland with heartbreaking clarity. Often, these cries would continue for hours or even days, as both sides were unable to risk rescue missions in the deadly open ground. Despite censorship, despite the chaos, despite the constant threat of death, soldiers in the trenches maintained a remarkable connection with the world they had left behind through letters. These fragments of paper, often stained with mud and sometimes blood, carried hopes, fears, love, and despair across the vast distance between the Western Front and home. Writing materials were precious in the trenches. Paper remained dry for only brief periods before the omnipresent moisture claimed it. Pencils were preferred over ink, which froze in winter and ran in the dampness. Many soldiers developed distinctive handwriting styles adapted to their circumstances. Smaller letters to conserve paper, simplified words to speed the writing process, coded language to evade the censors. The military postal system was one of the remarkable logistical achievements of the war. Despite the chaos of the battlefield, letters moved with surprising regularity between the trenches and home. The arrival of mail became one of the most eagerly anticipated events in the cycle of trench life. Men would gather around as names were called out, watching the faces of their comrades light up with joy or darken with worry as letters were distributed. Reading a letter from home in the trenches was an almost surreal experience. The gentle, everyday concerns of civilian life, a child's progress in school, the weather in the garden, neighborhood gossip, seemed to belong to a different universe entirely. Yet these mundane details provided a crucial psychological anchor, reminding soldiers that somewhere beyond the barbed wire and shell craters, normal life continued to exist. Writing letters home presented its own challenges. Military censors read every piece of outgoing mail, striking out any information that might be useful to the enemy if intercepted. Soldiers couldn't mention their location, their unit designation, their casualties, or their plans. They developed creative ways to communicate forbidden information, references to mutual friends whose names contained geographic clues, descriptions of weather that indicated their general location, coded language that families learned to interpret. But beyond the practical challenges of censorship was the deeper difficulty of translating the experience of trench warfare into words that civilians could understand. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you convey the reality of living in constant fear without causing unbearable worry to loved ones at home? Many soldiers found themselves writing two different types of letters, the sanitized versions they actually sent, and the honest accounts they wrote but never mailed, sometimes keeping them as a form of diary or confession. The letters that have survived provide an extraordinary window into the minds and hearts of men facing circumstances that challenged the very foundations of human experience. Some focused on mundane details as a way of maintaining psychological normalcy. Others became profound meditations on life, death, and the meaning of sacrifice. Many contained requests that revealed the writer's understanding of their situation. Please take care of Mother. Please remember me to my friends. Please don't mourn too long if something happens. Beneath the visible horror of trench warfare lay another conflict entirely. A subterranean war fought by men who never saw the sky, who measured distance in yards of tunnel rather than miles of terrain, and who faced death not from bullets and shells, but from cave-ins, explosions, and the gradual poisoning of the air they breathed. The underground war began as both sides recognized that they couldn't go over no man's land. They couldn't go around the elaborate trench systems, so they would have to go under them. Military engineers, many of them experienced miners in civilian life, began digging tunnels beneath enemy positions with the goal of placing massive explosive charges directly under enemy fortifications. These mining operations were marvels of engineering conducted under impossibly difficult conditions. Tunnels had to be dug silently to avoid detection by enemy listeners equipped with sensitive sound detection equipment. Miners worked in shifts using small hand tools to excavate dirt and rock one bucket at a time. The soil was carried back through the tunnels and carefully disposed of where it wouldn't create suspicious mounds visible to enemy observers. The tunnelers worked in conditions that made the surface trenches seem comfortable by comparison. Underground, there was no natural light, no fresh air, and no quick escape route if something went wrong. The tunnels were narrow, often only wide enough for one man to crawl through, and reinforced with whatever timber could be scavenged. Cave-ins were a constant threat, and men could be buried alive with no hope of rescue. Air quality in the tunnels was another constant concern. Oil lamps consumed precious oxygen, and the deeper the tunnels went, the more stale the air became. Some tunnels had to be abandoned when the air became too poisonous to breathe. Others were equipped with primitive ventilation systems, hand-powered fans that pushed fresh air down through long tubes, though these systems were vulnerable to detection and sabotage. The psychological pressure on tunnelers was enormous. They worked in absolute darkness, listening constantly for sounds that might indicate enemy countermining operations. The fear of being trapped underground, of being buried alive, or of breaking through into an enemy tunnel and facing hand-to-hand combat in a space too small to maneuver created stress levels that even veterans of surface combat found difficult to endure. Both sides developed elaborate countermining techniques. Specialized listeners would place sensitive instruments against tunnel walls, trying to detect the sound of enemy digging. When enemy mining operations were discovered, counter-tunnels would be dug to intercept them, leading to underground battles fought with pistols, grenades, and sometimes just shovels and picks. The ultimate goal of mining operations was the placement of massive explosive charges beneath enemy positions. These charges, sometimes containing tons of high explosive, were designed to create enormous craters while destroying enemy fortifications and killing everyone in the immediate area. The explosions could be heard for miles and created shock waves that knocked down men standing hundreds of yards away. The largest of these mine explosions occurred at Messines Ridge in June 1917, when British engineers detonated 19 massive charges simultaneously. The explosion was reportedly heard in London, over 100 miles away, and created craters, some of which are still visible today. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical destruction. Men on both sides developed an irrational fear that the ground beneath their feet might suddenly erupt without warning. No unit remained in the frontline trenches permanently. The physical and psychological strain was too great for human endurance, and military commanders learned early in the war that troops had to be rotated regularly between frontline positions, support trenches, and rest areas behind the lines. This system of relief became one of the most crucial elements in maintaining the fighting effectiveness of armies that were engaged in a war of unprecedented duration and intensity. The typical rotation cycle varied depending on the sector and the tactical situation, but a common pattern involved 4 to 8 days in the frontline trenches, followed by a similar period in support positions, then a longer period, perhaps 2 weeks, in rest areas several miles behind the front. This cycle would then repeat, sometimes for months on end, creating a rhythm of anticipation, endurance, and brief recovery that defined the lives of millions of soldiers. The process of relief was itself a complex and dangerous operation. It typically took place at night, when darkness provided some protection from enemy observation and sniper fire. The incoming unit would move up through the communication trenches in single file, each man carrying not only his personal equipment but also his share of the supplies needed to sustain the position: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and materials for maintaining and improving the trench system. At the same time, the unit being relieved would prepare for withdrawal, gathering their equipment, briefing their replacements on the particular characteristics of their section of the line, and waiting for the signal to begin the dangerous journey back through the communication trenches to safety. These briefings were crucial. Each section of trench had its own personality, its own dangers, its own quirks that could mean the difference between life and death for the incoming troops. The communication trenches through which these reliefs moved were often the most dangerous part of the trench system. They were narrow, winding, and frequently subjected to artillery fire as enemy gunners tried to disrupt the movement of troops and supplies. Men moving through these trenches had to travel in single file, often bent over to avoid creating silhouettes, carrying heavy loads over distances that could stretch for miles. Getting lost in the maze of communication trenches was a constant danger, especially for units new to a particular sector. The trenches all looked similar in the dark, and signposts were often destroyed by shell fire or deliberately removed to confuse enemy raiders. Men could wander for hours in the wrong direction, sometimes stumbling into enemy positions or simply collapsing from exhaustion in an abandoned section of trench. The moment of actual relief, when one unit took over from another in the frontline positions, was both highly anticipated and extremely dangerous. It was the time when the trench was most crowded, when discipline was most likely to break down, and when enemy observers were most likely to detect unusual activity. The process had to be conducted quickly and quietly, with experienced soldiers showing newcomers the location of key positions, supply dumps, and danger areas. For the unit being relieved, the journey back to rest areas was often euphoric despite the dangers. Men who had spent days or weeks living in constant fear of death suddenly found themselves walking away from the immediate threat, each step taking them further from the sound of enemy fire and closer to the possibility of a hot meal, a dry place to sleep, and perhaps even a bath. The rest areas themselves varied enormously in quality and location. Some units were fortunate enough to be billeted in intact villages several miles behind the front, where they could sleep in real beds, eat hot food, and interact with civilians who still maintained some semblance of normal life. Others found themselves in camps of tents or huts that offered little more comfort than the trenches they had left, but at least provided relief from the immediate threat of enemy action. In the chaos and horror of trench warfare, few figures commanded more respect and admiration than the medical personnel who worked tirelessly to save lives under conditions that challenged every principle of medical practice. These men and women, doctors, nurses, stretcher bearers, and medical orderlies, performed miracles of healing in circumstances that seemed designed to make healing impossible. The journey of a wounded soldier from the frontline trench to proper medical care was itself a dangerous odyssey that many did not survive. It began with the regimental stretcher bearers, often volunteers who had received minimal medical training but possessed enormous courage and dedication. These men would crawl into no man's land under fire to retrieve the wounded, carry them back through the maze of trenches, and provide basic first aid using whatever supplies were available. The first stop for wounded soldiers was typically the regimental aid post, located in a dugout or reinforced shelter in the frontline area. Here, a military doctor, often a young physician with little experience in trauma surgery, would perform triage, deciding which wounds could be treated immediately, which required evacuation to better facilities, and which were beyond help. These decisions had to be made quickly, often in poor light, with limited supplies, and under the constant threat of enemy fire. Those who could be helped were given basic treatment and prepared for evacuation to the advanced dressing station, usually located in the support trench area. The journey between these facilities was made on stretchers carried by teams of bearers who had to navigate the narrow, winding communication trenches while carrying their precious cargo. This trip, which might cover several miles of difficult terrain, could take hours to complete and was itself often fatal to soldiers whose wounds might have been survivable under better conditions. The advanced dressing station was typically the first place where wounded soldiers encountered more sophisticated medical care. Here, military surgeons worked in conditions that would have appalled their civilian colleagues, operating by lamplight in underground chambers, using instruments that had been sterilized as well as possible under field conditions, and dealing with wounds that civilian doctors rarely saw. The types of injuries treated in these field medical facilities reflected the unique horrors of trench warfare. Shell fragments created massive, irregular wounds that were contaminated with dirt, cloth, and debris. High-velocity rifle bullets caused internal injuries that were difficult to diagnose and treat. Gas attacks created casualties with burned lungs and skin who required specialized care that was often unavailable. Perhaps most challenging of all were the cases of shell shock, the psychological casualties of war that the medical establishment was only beginning to understand. Soldiers who had shown remarkable courage under fire would suddenly be unable to function, paralyzed by fears they couldn't explain, suffering from symptoms that had no visible physical cause. Military doctors struggled to distinguish between genuine psychological trauma and what they suspected might be cowardice or malingering. The evacuation process continued with movement to casualty clearing stations, located further behind the lines but still within reach of enemy artillery. Here, more sophisticated surgery could be performed, and wounded soldiers could receive the kind of care that might actually save their lives. But even these facilities were overwhelmed during major offensives, when casualties arrived faster than they could be processed. The final stage of medical evacuation involved transport to base hospitals, often located in coastal towns where wounded soldiers could receive care comparable to what they might have received in civilian hospitals at home. But the journey to reach these facilities was long and dangerous, and many wounded soldiers died en route, victims not of their original injuries but of the inadequate medical care that was the best the military could provide under wartime conditions. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history, remember to hit that like button and subscribe to Doze Through History. We explore the past together, helping you drift toward restful sleep while learning about the experiences that shaped our world. The Western Front experienced the full cycle of seasons, and each brought its own particular challenges and miseries to the men trapped in the elaborate trench systems. Weather was not merely a backdrop to the war, it was an active participant that shaped tactics, determined the success or failure of operations, and added layers of suffering to an already unbearable situation. Winter in the trenches was perhaps the cruelest season of all. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. Soldiers wore every piece of clothing they owned, layering civilian clothes under military uniforms, wrapping their feet in newspapers, and sharing body heat with their comrades in the cramped dugouts. But staying warm was nearly impossible when you were standing in water that froze overnight, when your breath created clouds of vapor that might attract enemy snipers, and when fuel for heating was virtually non-existent. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy bullets. Soldiers would lose fingers and toes to the cold, and in severe cases, entire hands or feet would freeze solid and have to be amputated. Medical officers conducted daily inspections, checking for the telltale signs of frostbite and trying to catch cases early enough to prevent permanent damage. But with limited medical supplies and no way to provide adequate heating, these efforts often proved futile. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing and stayed there for weeks. Water in the trenches turned to ice, making movement treacherous. Weapons froze and became unreliable. Food froze solid and had to be thawed before it could be eaten, if cooking fires could be risked at all. Men died not from enemy action but from exposure, their bodies found frozen at their posts after particularly cold nights. Spring brought different challenges. As the snow melted and the ground began to thaw, the trenches transformed into rivers of mud. The famous mud of the Western Front was not ordinary mud. It was a peculiar mixture of clay, sand, water, and the decomposed remains of countless horses, men, and the detritus of war. This mud had an almost liquid consistency that could swallow a man whole, yet it clung to everything it touched with tenacious persistence. The spring thaw of 1917 was particularly devastating. Trenches that had been frozen solid during the winter became impassable quagmires. Soldiers sank knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, in the clinging mud. Equipment disappeared into the mire, never to be recovered. Men who fell into the deeper pools of liquid mud sometimes drowned before their comrades could pull them out. The mud made movement so difficult that relief operations took twice as long as normal, and wounded soldiers often died because stretcher bearers couldn't navigate the treacherous conditions. Summer brought its own torments. The heat made the stench of the trenches almost unbearable. Bodies that had been preserved by winter cold began to decompose rapidly, filling the air with the sickly sweet smell of death. Flies swarmed in incredible numbers, feeding on the corpses scattered throughout no man's land and then settling on the soldiers' food and water. Disease spread rapidly in the warm, humid conditions. The heat also made wearing gas masks nearly impossible. The rubber and canvas construction trapped body heat and moisture, creating conditions that were almost suffocating. Yet the threat of gas attacks meant that masks had to be carried at all times and donned at a moment's notice. Many soldiers suffered from heat exhaustion while wearing their protective equipment during gas alerts that turned out to be false alarms. Autumn was perhaps the most psychologically challenging season. As the leaves changed color and fell, as the air grew crisp and the light began to fade earlier each day, soldiers were reminded that another year of war was drawing to a close. For many, it was their second, third, or even fourth autumn in the trenches. The seasonal cycle that had once marked the comfortable rhythm of civilian life now served only to emphasize the seemingly endless nature of their ordeal. The autumn rains were particularly dreaded. They transformed the battlefield into a landscape that seemed designed by some malevolent deity to maximize human suffering. Shell craters filled with water, creating treacherous pools that could drown a wounded man. The communication trenches became streams, making movement between positions dangerous and exhausting. Equipment rusted, food spoiled, and morale plummeted as men realized they faced another winter in the same hellish conditions. Surviving in the trenches required skills that no military training could fully provide. Soldiers had to become experts in a dozen different fields: amateur engineers, meteorologists, psychologists, and philosophers. Those who lived longest were not necessarily the bravest or the strongest, but those who best adapted to the unique demands of this new form of warfare. Learning to sleep in the trenches was perhaps the most crucial survival skill. Men had to train themselves to fall asleep despite the constant noise of artillery fire, the uncomfortable conditions, and the ever-present fear of death. Some soldiers discovered they could sleep through anything except the particular sound of incoming shells headed directly for their position. Others learned to catnap in short intervals, never allowing themselves to fall into the deep sleep that might prevent them from responding quickly to an emergency. The art of staying dry was another essential skill that could mean the difference between life and death. Soldiers developed elaborate techniques for protecting their feet, their weapons, and their precious letters from home. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a dugout was likely to flood, when a section of trench was becoming unstable, and when the conditions were right for an enemy gas attack. Food preparation in the trenches required creativity and resourcefulness that would have impressed the most inventive chefs. Soldiers learned to cook using makeshift stoves constructed from empty cans, to preserve food in conditions where everything spoiled rapidly, and to make unappetizing military rations palatable through the addition of whatever herbs or seasonings they could forage. Some men became expert at trading with soldiers from other units, exchanging cigarettes for chocolate or ammunition for better boots. Perhaps most importantly, successful soldiers learned to manage their own psychology. They developed mental techniques for dealing with fear, boredom, and despair. Some men found solace in religion, others in dark humor. Many discovered that keeping busy, maintaining equipment, writing letters, or improving their section of trench helped them avoid dwelling on their circumstances. The buddy system became an informal but crucial element of trench survival. Men paired up with comrades who complemented their skills and temperament. One might be good at scrounging supplies while the other excelled at equipment maintenance. One might be naturally optimistic while the other was more cautious. These partnerships often meant the difference between survival and death, as men looked out for each other in ways that no military regulation could mandate. Experienced soldiers also learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in the tactical situation. They could tell from the pattern of artillery fire whether an attack was being planned, from the behavior of enemy snipers whether a raid was imminent, and from the movement of their own officers whether their unit was about to be moved to a more dangerous sector. The development of what soldiers called trench sense, an almost supernatural ability to detect danger, kept many men alive who might otherwise have become casualties. This sixth sense was partly based on experience and observation, but it also seemed to involve an almost mystical awareness of the rhythm and patterns of warfare that couldn't be taught or explained. The trenches of World War I gave birth to a unique language, a mixture of military terminology, slang, borrowed words from other languages, and euphemisms that allowed men to discuss the indescribable realities of their daily existence. This language served not just as a means of communication, but as a psychological defense mechanism that helped soldiers maintain their sanity in circumstances that challenged the very foundations of human experience. Going over the top became the phrase that described the ultimate test of courage, climbing out of the relative safety of the trench and advancing across no man's land toward enemy positions. The phrase itself was a masterpiece of understatement, reducing one of the most terrifying experiences imaginable to a simple, almost casual expression. Men who had gone over the top and returned were marked by the experience in ways that those who hadn't couldn't fully understand. The enemy was rarely referred to by formal names or official designations. Instead, soldiers developed a variety of nicknames that served to humanize, dehumanize, or simply familiarize their opponents. Germans became Fritz or Jerry, terms that suggested a kind of grudging familiarity rather than hatred. Americans called Germans Krauts, while Germans referred to Americans as Amos. These nicknames served to make the enemy seem more manageable, more human, and perhaps less frightening. Death, the constant companion of trench warfare, spawned an elaborate vocabulary of euphemisms. Men didn't die, they went west, bought it, copped a packet, or went for a Burton. These phrases served to distance the speakers from the reality of mortality that surrounded them. By refusing to use the stark, final word death, soldiers could maintain the psychological fiction that what happened to their comrades was somehow different from what might happen to them. Weapons and equipment developed their own nicknames that reflected the soldiers' relationship with the tools of their trade. Artillery shells were whiz-bangs, machine guns were chattering death, and gas attacks were hate, a simple word that perfectly captured the malevolent nature of chemical warfare. These nicknames served to familiarize the unfamiliar, to make the instruments of war seem less alien and threatening. The physical environment of the trenches also generated its own specialized vocabulary. The area between opposing trenches wasn't just empty ground, it was no man's land, a phrase that perfectly captured the desolate, abandoned nature of this deadly space. Trenches weren't just ditches. They were homes, cities, and streets, with names like Piccadilly Circus and Hellfire Corner that brought a touch of familiar humor to an alien landscape. Perhaps most remarkably, the soldiers developed an elaborate vocabulary for describing different types of fear and courage. There was a crucial distinction between being windy, nervous but still functional, and being yellow, paralyzed by fear. A man could be brave in the conventional sense, or he could have trench courage, the specific type of bravery required to function in the claustrophobic, dangerous environment of the Western Front. The language of the trenches also included elaborate codes and signals that allowed men to communicate essential information quickly and quietly. Hand signals, whistle codes, and verbal passwords became as important as any weapon in the soldier's arsenal. These communication systems had to be constantly changed to prevent enemy interception, creating a constantly evolving dialect that was incomprehensible to outsiders. This wartime language didn't disappear when the conflict ended. Many of the words and phrases coined in the trenches entered common usage and remain part of the English language today. More importantly, the veterans who returned home carried this language with them, and it became one of the ways they identified each other and maintained their bonds of shared experience. As darkness fell over the Western Front each night, a different kind of warfare began. The daylight hours belonged to the snipers and artillery observers, but the night belonged to the raiders, the scouts, and the men who crept through no man's land on missions that required skills more akin to burglary than soldiering. Night patrols were among the most dangerous and psychologically demanding duties in trench warfare. Small groups of soldiers, their faces blackened with mud or charcoal, would slip over the parapet and crawl through the tangled wire and shell craters of no man's land. Their missions varied. Sometimes they were gathering intelligence about enemy positions, sometimes they were attempting to capture prisoners for interrogation, and sometimes they were simply trying to dominate the psychological landscape of the battlefield by proving that they could move freely in the disputed territory. The art of moving silently through no man's land was a skill that took months to master and seconds to forget fatally. Every piece of equipment had to be secured so it wouldn't rattle or reflect light. Weapons had to be cleaned and oiled to prevent any metallic sounds. Even breathing had to be controlled, as the visible vapor from exhaled breath could give away a patrol's position to alert enemy sentries. The men selected for these patrols were often volunteers, soldiers who had demonstrated not just courage, but the specific type of nerve required for this solitary, dangerous work. They had to be able to lie motionless for hours in shell craters while enemy patrols passed nearby. They had to be able to navigate by starlight and sound through a landscape that changed constantly as new shell craters appeared and old landmarks were obliterated. Enemy patrols often encountered each other in the darkness of no man's land, leading to brief, vicious firefights that erupted without warning and ended just as suddenly. These encounters were typically fought at close range with pistols, grenades, and sometimes just knives and bayonets. The darkness made it impossible to distinguish friend from enemy until it was too late, and many soldiers were killed or wounded by their own comrades in the confusion. The intelligence gathered by these night patrols was often crucial to the success or failure of larger operations. Information about the strength of enemy positions, the location of machine gun nests, the condition of enemy wire, and the morale of opposing troops could only be obtained by men who were willing to risk their lives creeping close enough to enemy positions to observe them directly. Some soldiers developed reputations as particularly skilled patrol leaders, men who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to move through no man's land undetected and return with valuable intelligence. These men were both admired and feared by their comrades, admired for their skill and courage, feared because their success often led to assignments that seemed tantamount to suicide missions. The constant pressure of night patrol duty took a severe psychological toll on even the most courageous soldiers. Men who had performed dozens of successful patrols would sometimes suddenly refuse to leave the trench, overcome by a certainty that their luck had finally run out. Others became addicted to the adrenaline rush of the work, volunteering for increasingly dangerous missions until their inevitable luck ran out. The First World War marked a turning point in the relationship between technology and warfare. The trenches of the Western Front became a testing ground for weapons and tactics that would reshape the nature of human conflict forever. The machinery of death that emerged from this crucible was more efficient, more deadly, and more impersonal than anything the world had ever seen. The machine gun was perhaps the weapon that most clearly defined the character of trench warfare. These mechanical instruments of death could fire hundreds of rounds per minute with deadly accuracy, creating zones of fire that no human courage could cross. A single well-positioned machine gun could hold up an entire battalion, mowing down attacking soldiers with methodical efficiency. The psychological impact of machine guns was as significant as their tactical effectiveness. The sound of their mechanical chatter became the signature noise of the Western Front, a rhythmic reminder of the industrial nature of modern warfare. Soldiers learned to recognize the different sounds made by various types of machine guns: the slow, deliberate fire of the German Maxim, the faster chatter of the British Vickers, the distinctive sound of the French Hotchkiss. Artillery was the true king of the Western Front battlefield. More soldiers were killed and wounded by artillery fire than by all other weapons combined. The guns ranged from small trench mortars that could be carried by a few men to massive railway-mounted cannons that could fire shells weighing over a ton across distances of more than 20 miles. The development of artillery tactics became a science in itself. Gunners learned to create precise barrages that could isolate sections of enemy trenches, to lay down protective fire that would shield attacking infantry, and to conduct counter-battery fire that could silence enemy guns. The coordination between infantry and artillery became crucial to the success of any major operation. But perhaps the most sinister development was the increasing use of chemical weapons. What began as a crude expedient, releasing chlorine gas from cylinders when the wind was favorable, evolved into a sophisticated science of chemical warfare. Mustard gas, phosgene, and other chemical agents were deployed using specialized artillery shells that could deliver precise doses of poison to specific targets. The development of tanks represented an attempt to break the stalemate of trench warfare through the application of new technology. These mechanical monsters, as they were often called, were designed to cross no man's land, crush barbed wire obstacles, and provide mobile fire support for attacking infantry. The early tanks were crude, unreliable machines that often broke down before reaching their objectives, but they represented a glimpse of the future of warfare. Perhaps most significantly, the war saw the birth of military aviation as a significant factor in battlefield operations. What began with unarmed reconnaissance aircraft evolved into a complex aerial warfare system that included fighters, bombers, and specialized ground attack aircraft. The skies above the Western Front became another battlefield, where young pilots engaged in single combat that seemed almost medieval in its personal nature, even as they employed the most advanced technology of their time. The industrialization of warfare meant that victory increasingly depended not just on the courage and skill of individual soldiers, but on the ability of entire nations to mobilize their industrial capacity for military production. The trenches of the Western Front consumed ammunition, equipment, and supplies at a rate that would have been inconceivable in earlier conflicts. As you continue to relax and let these stories from history wash over you, remember that these tales of human endurance and technological innovation remind us how far we've come. If you're finding peace in these historical journeys, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Doze Through History. We explore the past together, helping you drift toward restful sleep. By 1918, the Western Front had consumed 4 years of human life and national treasure. The men in the trenches were no longer the enthusiastic volunteers of 1914 or even the grimly determined soldiers of 1916. They were survivors of an ordeal that had tested the limits of human endurance, and they carried the weight of experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 marked the beginning of the end of the static warfare that had characterized the conflict for so long. Desperate to achieve victory before American forces could arrive in decisive numbers, the German High Command launched a series of massive attacks that briefly restored mobility to the Western Front. For the first time in years, the trench lines moved significantly, and soldiers found themselves fighting in open country rather than the claustrophobic confines of the trenches. But the offensive also revealed the fundamental weakness of the trench warfare system. Armies that had become expert at defending fixed positions were poorly equipped for mobile warfare. Supply lines that had been carefully constructed to support static positions collapsed when the front lines moved. Soldiers who had learned to survive in the trenches found themselves vulnerable and confused when forced to fight in the open. The failure of the German offensive marked the beginning of the final phase of the war. As summer turned to autumn in 1918, it became clear that the Central Powers could no longer sustain the enormous costs of the conflict. The elaborate trench systems that had defined the war began to empty as armies retreated or advanced, leaving behind the underground cities that had housed millions of men for 4 terrible years. The armistice that ended the fighting on November 11, 1918, found many soldiers still in their trenches, still maintaining the routines that had kept them alive for so long. The sudden silence that fell over the Western Front at 11 a.m. on that November morning was perhaps more shocking than the constant noise of battle had been. Men who had lived with the sound of artillery fire for years found the quiet almost unbearable. The evacuation of the trenches was a complex process that took weeks to complete. Soldiers emerged from their underground shelters like miners coming up from deep shafts, blinking in the daylight and struggling to readjust to a world without the constant threat of immediate death. Many found it difficult to leave positions they had defended for months or years, places that had become home despite their horror. The physical trenches themselves remained as scars on the landscape long after the war ended. Some were filled in or plowed over, but others remained as monuments to the conflict. Today, nearly a century later, traces of the Western Front trench system can still be found in the fields of France and Belgium, subtle indentations in the earth that mark where millions of men lived and died. But the deeper trenches, the psychological and emotional excavations that the war had carved in the minds and hearts of the survivors, proved far more permanent. The men who returned from the Western Front carried with them memories and experiences that couldn't be shared with those who hadn't been there. They had seen and done things that challenged their fundamental understanding of human nature and the meaning of civilization. Long after the guns fell silent and the trenches were abandoned, the Western Front remained populated by ghosts. Not the supernatural spirits of folklore, but the memories, the trauma, and the unfinished business of a war that had consumed a generation and left scars that would never fully heal. The missing were perhaps the most haunting legacy of trench warfare. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers simply disappeared, vaporized by shell fire, buried in collapsed trenches, or lost in the mud of no man's land. Their families waited for news that never came, hoping for letters that were never written, searching for graves that didn't exist. The phrase "missing in action" became one of the cruelest euphemisms in any language, an official acknowledgement of loss without the finality that might allow for proper mourning. The survivors carried their own ghosts and memories of comrades who had died beside them, faces of enemies they had killed, sounds and smells that would trigger sudden flashbacks decades after the war ended. Shell shock, as it was called then, didn't end with the armistice. Many veterans spent the rest of their lives fighting a war that existed only in their minds, battling enemies that only they could see, trying to save comrades who had died years earlier. The physical landscape of the Western Front became a vast cemetery, but one where most of the dead were never properly buried. Bodies lay scattered across hundreds of square miles, some in marked graves, others in mass burial sites, many simply absorbed into the earth itself. The soil of France and Belgium became, quite literally, a mixture of earth and human remains that farmers would continue to uncover for generations to come. The unexploded ordnance left behind by the war created another kind of ghost, a hidden danger that would claim lives long after the conflict ended. Shells that had failed to explode when fired during the war remained buried in the earth, waiting to kill unwary farmers, children playing in fields, or construction workers building new homes on old battlefields. Even today, over a century later, these deadly remnants of the war continue to claim occasional victims. The psychological impact of trench warfare extended far beyond the men who had actually served in the trenches. Entire communities were transformed by the loss of their young men, their teachers, their leaders, their future. The social fabric of European society was permanently altered by the missing generation that had fallen in the trenches of the Western Front. Perhaps most tragically, the lessons learned in the trenches of World War I were quickly forgotten or ignored. The next generation of military leaders convinced themselves that future wars would be different, that the static horror of trench warfare had been an aberration rather than a glimpse into the future of industrial conflict. The stage was set for an even more devastating war just 20 years later. The literature, art, and music that emerged from the experience of trench warfare represented humanity's attempt to make sense of an experience that seemed to defy comprehension. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon tried to capture the reality of life in the trenches, while artists like Otto Dix painted nightmarish visions of the mechanical slaughter they had witnessed. But even these artistic achievements seemed inadequate to convey the full scope of what had occurred. As we near the end of our journey through the trenches of the Western Front, it's worth reflecting on what this chapter of human history teaches us about resilience, sacrifice, and the complex nature of human conflict. The soldiers who endured these conditions were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and somehow managed to survive. The trenches of World War I represent both the worst and the best of human nature. They were places where industrial technology was applied to the ancient art of killing with unprecedented efficiency. Yet they were also places where ordinary men displayed extraordinary courage, compassion, and loyalty to their comrades. The same conditions that brought out the worst in human nature also revealed depths of character that might never have been discovered in peacetime. The medical advances that emerged from the necessity of treating unprecedented numbers of wounded soldiers eventually benefited all of humanity. Techniques for treating trauma, advances in prosthetics, and improvements in surgical procedures that were developed on the battlefields of France and Belgium saved countless lives in the decades that followed. The international cooperation required to care for the wounded and bury the dead created precedents for humanitarian law that continue to influence how nations conduct themselves in conflict. The Geneva Conventions, the International Red Cross movement, and other institutions designed to limit the suffering caused by war all have roots in the lessons learned during the First World War. Perhaps most importantly, the experience of trench warfare demonstrated both the tremendous capacity of human beings to endure suffering and their equally tremendous capacity to inflict it. The men who lived and died in the trenches of the Western Front were neither heroes nor villains in any simple sense. They were human beings caught up in forces beyond their control, trying to maintain their humanity in circumstances that seemed designed to destroy it. The trenches are empty now, filled with earth and overgrown with grass. The Western Front has returned to farmland, forests, and peaceful towns. But the lessons learned in those muddy ditches about courage and cowardice, about loyalty and betrayal, about the price of freedom and the cost of war, remain as relevant today as they were a century ago. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that the peace and comfort you enjoy was purchased by the sacrifice of those who endured conditions we can barely imagine. Their story is our story, their struggle is part of our shared human heritage, and their memory deserves to be preserved not just in books and monuments, but in our continued commitment to building a world where such sacrifice is no longer necessary. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most challenging chapters. If you found this exploration of the trenches of World War I helpful for your rest and relaxation, please consider subscribing to Doze Through History and hitting that notification bell. We have many more fascinating stories from the past waiting to be told, all designed to help you drift off to peaceful sleep while expanding your understanding of our shared human experience. Like this video if it helped you relax, and let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to explore together. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that every peaceful night is a gift that should never be taken for granted. Sweet dreams, and good night from all of us at Doze Through History.